There is a moment, just before dawn on the Great Plains, when the world goes completely silent. The wind dies, the grass stops moving, and the only sound left is the river, steady, calm, almost inviting. And that is exactly when the Lakota would turn their backs and walk away. Not because they were afraid of the dark, not because the water was poisoned, but because they knew something that took the rest of the world centuries to understand. Something so counterintuitive, so deeply buried in forgotten history, that even today, most survival experts have never heard it spoken out loud. The river that gave life to everything around it was the same river that could erase your entire world before sunrise. These were not timid people. The Lakota warriors of the Great Plains rode into battle against impossible odds without blinking. They navigated thousands of miles of open wilderness with nothing but memory and instinct. They survived conditions that would break most modern humans within 48 hours. And yet, when it came time to choose where their people would sleep, where their children would be kept safe, where their weapons would be stored, they chose the high ground. Every single time. Not the riverbank. Not the valley. The hill. Why? The answer is not simple. It is not one reason. It is seven. 7 survival codes, passed down through generations of lived experience and quiet observation, that schools never taught, that history books buried, and that the modern world has nearly lost forever. Stay with us, because by the time we reach the 7th rule, the way you see wilderness and water will never be the same again. This is Primal Echoes, and this is the forgotten survival code of the Lakota. The first rule had nothing to do with enemies. It had everything to do with something far more subtle, something that crept in before dawn, wrapped itself around the entire camp, and turned the most well-trained eyes in North America into useless instruments. It was fog, river fog, and if you have never stood at the edge of a lowland river on a cold Great Plains morning, you cannot imagine what it looks like. It does not drift in gently. It swallows everything. Imagine waking up and your entire world has gone white. You cannot see the tree 10 feet in front of you. You cannot see your own hands. And somewhere out there, beyond that wall of white silence, something, or someone, is moving. The Lakota understood this phenomenon with a precision that bordered on scientific. They knew that river fog formed in the lowest points of the landscape, where cold night air pooled and moisture condensed into a thick, unbroken veil. They knew it was always wetter, denser, and colder than the mist that sometimes settled on the hills above. And most importantly, they knew that an enemy who understood this, an enemy willing to move through that fog before dawn, had a nearly perfect cover. A campsite in the valley, no matter how well guarded, became blind the moment that white veil descended. But a camp on high ground? From up there, the sentries could look down across an ocean of fog and watch for the slightest disturbance in its surface. The ripple, the displacement, the subtle sign that something large was moving through it below. The high ground did not just give them visibility, it gave them time. And on the Great Plains, time was the difference between life and a grave no one would ever find. Rule 1. Never let the landscape blind your judgment. But sight was only half of it, because the river had a second weapon, one that struck even deeper, even quieter, and even more completely. Sound. A skilled Lakota warrior in open country could detect the snap of a dry branch from 300 meters away. He could hear the difference between the wind shifting through grass and the careful, deliberate step of a man trying not to be heard. That hearing, that extraordinary, life-saving sensitivity, was one of the most valuable survival tools the Lakota possessed. And the river took it away entirely. The constant rush of moving water, the lap of current against stone, the low, steady roar of even a shallow rapid, all of it created a wall of noise that drowned out everything else. A night guard posted near the riverbank was not a guard. He was a man standing in the dark, hearing nothing, protecting no one. The enemy could move through the brush, knock over gear, take out a sentry, and the sound of the river would swallow every trace of it whole. A warrior's greatest weapon was not his bow, not his knife, not his horse. It was silence. And the river stole it without asking. Rule 2. Your ears must be as sharp as the open wind, and nothing must be allowed to dull them. So the Lakota solved both problems the same way, by moving up, by choosing the elevated ground where fog could not reach, and where the wind carried sound freely across the open plain, amplifying every footstep, every snapped twig, every distant movement into a clear and readable signal. But here is what makes this even more remarkable. Because what the river was doing to their weapons while they slept, that is something no history book ever thought to warn about. And it may be the most dangerous rule of all. There is a kind of destruction that never announces itself. It does not arrive with war cries or the thunder of hooves. It seeps in slowly, silently, while you sleep. And by morning, it has already done its worst. The river did not need an army. It had patience and humidity. The Lakota warriors were masters of the bow. Their sinew bowstrings, carefully dried, precisely twisted, maintained with the kind of attention most people today reserve for nothing, were instruments of extraordinary precision and power. But sinew is organic. It breathes. It responds to the environment around it the way living tissue responds to disease. In high humidity, sinew bowstrings can lose up to 40% of their tension in a single night. Not gradually, over weeks. One night, one damp, riverside night, and a weapon that could send an arrow 300 yards with killing accuracy becomes something closer to a toy. The wooden frame of the bow warped. The hide glue that bonded it together softened and gave way. The leather of the quiver, the shield, the protective gear, all of it absorbed moisture and became heavy, misshapen, and unreliable. And when the tribes began acquiring firearms, the problem only worsened. Black powder in a damp environment does not fire. It simply sits there, wet and useless, while the moment you needed it most passes forever. The river did not need to defeat the Lakota in battle. It only needed one night near their camp to quietly dismantle everything they would have used to survive. Rule 3. The weapon that fails you in battle was already killed the night before. But humidity was patient. Flood was not. And of all the dangers the Great Plains could unleash upon a sleeping camp, nothing was faster, nothing was more absolute, and nothing left less time to react than a flash flood arriving in the middle of the night. Here is what most people do not understand about flash floods on the Great Plains. You do not need rain where you are standing. A violent storm 50 miles away, far beyond the horizon, far beyond anything you could see or hear or sense, sends water rushing into dry riverbeds and shallow channels with a speed and force that defies belief. The water did not roar before it arrived. There was no warning, no gradual rising of the current. It simply appeared, a wall of black water, carrying trees and debris and the accumulated violence of a distant storm. And then everything was gone. Teepees, supplies, horses, people, gone. The Lakota scouts knew to read the landscape for the memory of past floods. They studied the waterline marks left high in the branches of riverside trees, silent records of how far the water had reached in years before. Those marks were not curiosities. They were warnings left by nature itself, and by the people who had not listened. Camp was always set well above the highest mark, always, because the Great Plains does not give second chances, and the river does not apologize for what it takes. But as terrifying as that wall of water was, there was something else hiding in the water, something invisible, something that moved without sound and left no mark on any tree branch, something that killed not in a single violent night, but slowly, quietly, over days and weeks. And that is where the next rule begins. After the flood receded, the Great Plains fell quiet again. The sky cleared, the sun returned, and scattered across the lowlands. In every hollow and depression where the water had pooled and stalled and stopped moving, something began to grow. You could not see it, you could not smell it at first, but the Lakota knew it was there, because they had watched what happened to those who ignored it. Standing water, warmed by the prairie sun, cut off from the flow of the main current, becomes something entirely different from the river that fed it. It becomes a breeding ground, a slow, silent accumulation of everything the moving water had carried. Decay, sickness, invisible life that thrives in warmth and stillness. The Lakota had no microscopes. They had no germ theory, no scientific framework for what they were observing. But they understood what science would only confirm centuries later. That stagnant water makes people sick, that the heavy air hanging over a marsh carries something harmful in it, and that prolonged exposure to those lowland vapors drains the strength from even the strongest body. They did not need a laboratory to reach that conclusion. They had generations of observation, of cause and effect, of watching communities weaken and falter when camps were placed too close to still water. Rule 5. Flee the water that has forgotten how to move. But the Lakota relationship with high ground went far beyond avoiding what was dangerous below. The elevated campsite was not simply a defensive position. It was a statement, a declaration of presence, of power, of intentional dominance over the landscape. From the high ground, sentries could see dust rising on the horizon from a moving force miles away, giving the tribe time to prepare, to position, to respond rather than react. The circular arrangement of the teepees on an open hilltop created a natural fortress without a single wall, a perimeter of visibility and mobility that no valley camp could replicate. And there was something else, something that modern military academies, including West Point, still teach today under the principle of commanding heights: the psychological weight of elevation. An enemy moving uphill toward a prepared position is not just physically disadvantaged, he is mentally disadvantaged. Every step upward costs him energy and confidence. Every arrow or stone coming down from above carries the additional force of gravity and the crushing awareness that the people above him are calm, ready, and watching. An enemy looking up at you has already lost half the battle in his mind. Rule 6. He who stands above controls not just the land, but the will of those below. And then winter came, and with it, the final, and perhaps most quietly lethal lesson of all. Cold air is heavy. It sinks. It flows downward the way water flows downward, pooling in the lowest available space, filling valleys, river hollows, and lowland depressions with a concentrated bone-cutting cold that the open plateau never experienced with the same intensity. The temperature in a river valley on a January night on the Great Plains could be several critical degrees colder than on the hill just above it. Several degrees that mean the difference between a fire that sustains you and a fire that cannot keep up. Several degrees that seep through the thickest buffalo hide and steal the warmth from sleeping bodies before dawn. And that was only part of it. The ice that formed over the rivers looked solid. It looked safe. But beneath that surface, the current still moved, weakening the ice from below, creating thin spots and dark pools that gave no warning before they gave way. Spring floods buried the lowlands under water and snow. Blizzards packed the valleys with drifts so deep that escape became impossible. The valley looked like shelter, low, enclosed, protected from the wind. But shelter and trap can look identical, until it is too late to tell the difference. The Lakota had learned this, not from books, but from loss, from the winters that took people who chose the wrong ground, and they carried that knowledge forward, encoded into their decision-making, so deeply that it required no debate. Rule 7. Winter does not forgive those who trust the wrong landscape. 7 rules: fog, sound, moisture, flood, stillness, power, cold. Each one a layer of understanding built not in a classroom, but in the unforgiving open air of the Great Plains, across generations of people who had no margin for error and no tolerance for forgetting. And now, there is one thing left to say, the most important thing of all. Here is the thing that most people misunderstand about the Lakota and water. They were not afraid of it. Fear is not the right word, and it matters that we get this right. These were people who crossed raging rivers on horseback, who harvested ice in brutal January winds, who sent small groups of women down to the riverbank every morning to collect water for hundreds of people, who used the river for ceremony, for purification, for the sacred rituals that connected them to something larger than themselves. They did not fear the river, they respected it, and there is a distance between those two things that contains an entire philosophy of life. When European settlers arrived on the Great Plains, they did what settlers had always done. They built beside the water, forts on riverbanks, towns in floodplains, settlements tucked into valleys where the soil was dark and the access to water was easy and immediate. It seemed like the obvious choice. It seemed like wisdom. And within a generation, many of those settlements had been flooded, sickened, or destroyed by the very river they had chosen to live beside. The Lakota watched this happen and understood it completely, because they had already learned that lesson, not from observation of others, but from their own losses, their own history, their own dead. True wisdom is not conquering nature. It is knowing exactly how close you can stand before it consumes you. That knowledge did not die with the nomadic era of the Great Plains. Today, military strategists still study the principle of commanding heights. Survival experts still teach the danger of low-ground camping. Emergency planners still map floodplains and warn against building in valleys. The code the Lakota lived by was not primitive instinct. It was applied science, centuries ahead of the language we would eventually use to describe it. And so now, at the end of this, think back to that moment we described at the very beginning. The silence before dawn, the river, steady and calm, almost inviting. The Lakota warrior who turns his back and walks away. Now you know why. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood, more completely than almost anyone in human history, exactly what that river was capable of. Now you know why the most fearless warriors on the Great Plains feared the river. This is Primal Echoes. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and stay with us, because the next chapter of forgotten survival wisdom is already waiting. Leave a comment below and tell us which of the 7 rules surprised you most. We read every one, and we will see you in the next one.